is the MIAA Weekly.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the MIAA Weekly. We are going to look forward to Week 11, the last regular season week. Should be a fun end to the season, even if the games, quite honestly, are kind of lackluster. But we do have some things to look forward to in terms of the entire league. I'm Brandon Misener, joined today by Jon Dykstra from the Maryville Forum. Jon, thank you for being with me today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
It's great to have you here. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to review last week's games in the MIAA. Two good games that were in a battle for a game of the week, and both of them lived up to their billing in one way or another. After that, three members of the MIAA are in serious contention for a playoff spot. We'll break down the regional rankings as they relate to the MIAA. After that, we'll predict this week's outcomes. Like I said just a second ago, it's kind of a lackluster schedule. I don't think there's anything that qualifies as a game of the week. Jon might disagree. We'll talk about that later. One other thing we're going to do. Next week, we will not have an edition of MIAA Weekly. Instead, on d2football.com, we'll have a preview and a discussion about the Super Region 3 playoffs. So because of that, I wanted the ability and the chance to honor kids who have had a great season in the MIAA. And we're going to try to predict as best we can the way we think the coaches will select the first team, All-MIAA team, in a week from now, or I guess a few days from now. But we're going to try to predict that without having the knowledge of what happens in Week 11. We'll also predict the Coach of the Year, Freshman of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, and the Offensive Player of the Year. But let's start out with last week's games. And I'm going to share that screen right here. And if you look at the games, several good ones. Going into the week, I kind of predicted that the two games of the week were going to be Fort Hays at Central Missouri or Pittsburgh State at Missouri Western. And I went with Fort Hays at Central Missouri as the game of the week. And it lived up to its billing in some ways. And the reason I picked that was because I thought Central Missouri could be hurt by a loss. And I said that Missouri Western could not be helped by a win. Well, that was obviously incorrect. And it turns out that Pitt State at Missouri Western was the game of the weekend. It was an outstanding result and an important win for the Griffins. But this game was close either way. No team ever led by more than a score. And in fact, there was only back-to-back scores once in the football game. Pittsburgh State initially led 3-0, and then Missouri Western recovered a fumble at the PSU 3, scored, making it 7-3. Pitt State answers, and then Missouri Western answers, ties it at 10. So we got a field goal by both teams, touchdown by both teams. Pitt State able to punch it in there with Chad Dotson, who had a bunch of passing yards on the game and a few rushing yards. Second half, we go to second half. Missouri Western was able to get in and score on a 1-yard run. That tied the game at 17 after Missouri Western led 17-10 at the half. And then the only back-to-back scores of the game were Seth Cromwell's 8-yard run there. So now Missouri Western's up 24-7. PSU answers there with a pass to Mario Kirby. Missouri Western answers again with a pass to Jonas Bennett. And then Pittsburgh State would answer with this long touchdown pass, a 45-yard pass to Cleo Chandler. But the PAT hit the lineman in the backside and left it 31-30. And there you see the sack and the fumble that ended the game. And Missouri Western came away with a 31-30 win. I said on Inside D2 Football that it was a game that Pitt probably looks at and thinks that they made, a couple too many mistakes and should have won. But nonetheless, what were your thoughts on the outcome of that one, Jon?
Well, an important note and going forward for Pitt, I think, is Chad Dotson did get hurt on the last drive and
Right.
had to come out of the game in that. And yeah, you mentioned his numbers, but 20 for 24 passing, 324 yards, 3 touchdowns, and the 1 interception. That might have been that very well could have been his best game in a Pittsburgh State uniform, and he's done some really good things for them. On the other side, though, Imani Eden, he's kind of been just that facilitator this year. I think for Western, they're obviously built on that running game, but man, 16 for 23. 195 yards. That's a really good game for him, and it's something they're going to need if they do in fact make the playoffs, and they're gonna have to be a little bit more balanced. But it's obviously a huge win for Western, the best win they've had in years, going back to the Jerry Partridge days.
Absolutely.
So
12, absolutely. So,
yeah,
one of the couple of things I found interesting, uh, Missouri Western had 4 players with 4 or more receptions, so they really spread it around a lot. Devin Garrison had a big game for Pitt, 5 receptions, 90 yards, an elite 100 player, and he's certainly playing well. And again, you mentioned Imani Eden. I've noticed that they're never putting up big stats, but the combination of whoever plays at quarterback for Missouri Western, they're very efficient all year long. So they're not making mistakes, but they're also not winning you a game either. Was that your evaluation of the team?
that is too. I think Reagan Jones, who obviously was a starter last year, has made some serious strides. I think he's been a lot better when he's been in there. It's just Eden's obviously the transfer in, and he's earned that job and kept that job. A guy that I think gets some love around St. Joe, but maybe not as much nationally, is Jonas Bennett too, who led him in receiving. He was a running back last year for him, and made that switch out to receiver. He's been a return threat for him in the past. He's electric when the ball's in his hands, and 4 catches, 79 yards, and a touchdown. He had a real nice game too. So he'll be a guy that, like I said, if they make the playoffs, some more people might be noticing him, because he's a big time playmaker for him on the outside.
All right. Well, let's move on to Central Missouri game versus Fort Hays, the game that I thought would be the game of the week. It was close for a while, but eventually Central Missouri took control of the game. It was another big game for Zach Zabrowski for Central Missouri. He had 459 yards and 5 touchdowns. He was one of many MIAA quarterbacks that had big numbers over the weekend. Arkell Smith had 10 receptions, 149 yards, and 2 touchdowns. You're seeing one of them there. I mentioned before the game that Jack Dawson's ability inability to stop turning the ball over could hurt them. He did not do a bad job there. Only 1 pick, but he was not accurate. It was not his best game. He was 29 to 53 for 261. 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. And it just was a game where Central Missouri proved that they could move the ball against anybody, because I think Fort Hays certainly a top 3 defense, if not better, in the MIAA. And Central Missouri scored 47. I'd predicted a 38-31 win for the Mules, but they took control of this one, 147 to 28. What were your thoughts, if you had any, about that game, John?
The game script was just interesting. I mean, with 2 minutes left in the half, Hayes took a 28-21 lead. Like that opened eyes around the league, I think, because I think, like the slate wasn't great last week, but this was a lot of people's one they would keep an eye on to kind of see how for real Hayes is. I think UCM's proven it against really good teams all year. But Hayes, this was their chance to make a statement. Having the lead at halftime is a good statement. They were up 28-24 at halftime, and then obviously it ended up being all UCM in the second half, shutting them out, which I think is a is a note moving forward for that UCM defense, which is the question mark going into the playoffs is,
Absolutely.
can they stop those elite teams in this region? And I think, I mean, there are a lot better offenses out there than Hayes is, but it's a good statement when you struggled in the first half to put up a 0 in the second half.
Agreed. So, all right, those were the two best games last week. Let's go ahead and look at some of the other games. This would have been like the third game if I had to pick in terms of what a game of the week would have been. Emporia State, I predicted a 35-21 win for Emporia at Missouri Southern or over Missouri Southern. And the game was a blowout. Emporia State wins 63-28. Braden Gleason was 42 of 46 for 482 and 4 touchdowns. Can anybody stop the ball in the air in the MIAA?
Man, I mean, if Zach Zabrowski didn't exist, we'd be saying some pretty great things about Braden Gleason.
It's crazy. Yeah, he had, like I said, 482, 4 touchdowns, and was overshadowed by Zabrowski. Jalen Varner had 11 receptions, 105, and Tyler Common had 9 receptions for 174, 2 touchdowns for Emporia. So they were just, putting up, video game kind of stats and the kind you put in 15-minute quarters, not just 5-minute quarters. Let's look at some other ones. Central Oklahoma beat Washburn 41-7. I predicted a 28-21 win for UCO, but it was a dominant performance by them against a struggling Washburn team. Dawson Hurl had 283 yards passing for Central Oklahoma, and Washburn was held to only 240 yards of offense. Young team, it's been a struggle all year, John. It's not been good for the Ichabods. Yeah.
I actually predicted, because I needed to make up game. We were talking about it off show. I needed to make up games in my pick'em and in the one we put in the paper. And I predicted Washburn to win just on a whim because I haven't been impressed with UCO lately. But there was a big kind of statement win that they are not in that lower echelon. They are firmly in that middle of the pack in the league.
Very good. Northwest Missouri goes to Northeastern State, wins 52-0. I had picked 56-13. So I'm not embarrassed by that prediction. That's pretty close. Mike Hohensee had 359 and 6 touchdowns for the Bearcats, and Jay Harris continued his dominance on the ground, 108 yards in the game. Northwest defense holds Northeastern State to 124 yards of total offense. And let's go ahead and move to the next one, John. We don't need to talk about these blowouts because Nebraska Kearney beats Lincoln 38-6. I predicted 37-7, so that's pretty impressive. I'm pretty proud of that one. TJ Davis, disappointing senior season, had a good game, 229 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 168 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. And Lincoln was held to 179 yards of total offense. So once again, man, the quarterbacks put up some amazing numbers this week. And, in any other week, there could have been 5 different guys who got player of the week. But
when Hohensee throws for 350 and 6 touchdowns and is the 3rd best quarterback performance in the league, that's a pretty special week.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and look at the MIAA standings. At the top is Central Missouri. They're 9-1. Pittsburgh State 8-1. They'll make up that gap with a win this week. Missouri Western 7-2. Emporia State 6-3. Fort Hays 6-3. Northwest Missouri 5-4. Central Oklahoma, as you said, clearly in that middle portion. Now, would you consider Missouri Southern to be in the middle portion as well? Or would you consider
I would. Okay. Because they have been a lot more competitive this year, I think, in their games. I know the record's only 1 game better than Kearney, but they've been a competitive team, and I still like what Atiba Bradley's doing there. The last few years, I've been beating this drum that I'm a big fan of what he's doing in Joplin, and I think I this year didn't go the way they wanted, but they've been competitive against those middle of the pack teams in the league, and even some of the upper tier teams.
So then UNK, Northeastern State, and Washburn, you would consider the bottom third of the conference or whatever. Okay, I agree with you there. So, well, as I said, a minute ago, I had predicted that Missouri Western couldn't find a way to get into the playoffs because that's why I didn't have them as the game of the week against Pitt State. I just thought that they were too far down the list to make a difference, even with a win. But I obviously thought Pittsburgh State would win. That's the only game I've missed so far doing the MIAA Weekly. But Missouri Western is in good position, not a secure position, but a good position for the playoffs. So let's look at the regional rankings as they affect the MIAA, or where the MIAA teams stand. Central Missouri is behind Pittsburgh State simply because of the head-to-head matchup. When they're that close, the numbers are that close, the head-to-head is going to come into play. And as you see, looking across the columns, the numbers are incredibly close. And so in spite of a slightly lower SOS, Pittsburgh State is above Central Missouri because they won head-to-head in Warrensburg. The other MIAA team, and this is the most interesting one to talk about, is Missouri Western. They are in 7th place right now. So you see that and you think, wow, if playoffs were to start this week, we'd be in if you live in St. Joe, if you're a Griffin fan. Mm-hmm. You also think, hey, if we win this weekend, we'll be in. Well, there's no guarantee that would happen. Plus, as Griffin fans are discovering, earned access is kind of throwing a little, they're throwing the shoe into the cog and destroying the factory, or at least trying to disrupt Missouri Western's goal of getting in there. Let me explain to you how this works. Indianapolis, if the playoffs were to start this week, would actually be in over Missouri Western because Indianapolis would take advantage of a rule called earned access. And when earned access comes into play, it's when the highest rated member of a conference is in the top 9, but not in the top 7. They moved it from 10 to 9. It would have been easier just to leave it at 10 and know that you had to be in the top 10. Yeah. But if you look at it, Harding at the top is a GAC team. Grand Valley and Ferris State are GLIAC teams. Harding and Ouachita are GAC teams. Mm-hmm. Grand Valley and Ferris State are GLIAC teams. Pitt State, Central Missouri, and Missouri Western are MIAA teams. Indianapolis is a member of the GLVC. They are not represented in the top 10. So because they are the highest ranked, highest rated GLVC team, conference champion doesn't matter, the highest ranked GLVC team, they would slip in and bump the 7. In a theoretical situation where there was another conference and Davenport was, let's say, in a fictional conference, they could also bump a team. So earned access could actually be the 6 and the 7 get bumped. It just depends on the scenario every year. But this year, Indianapolis will bump the 7 seed if they win this weekend and stay ranked 8 or 9. Now, what has to happen so that does not happen to Missouri Western? Well, first thing can happen would be Indianapolis is upset by Southwest Baptist. The second thing that has to happen would be
the second thing that could happen.
Right.
If either of these things happen, Western could be is likely in.
Yes, exactly. Ouachita Baptist will play Henderson State, and it's possible that loss could flip Ouachita and Western, or however you want to look at it, to different positions. So Missouri Western could move to 6 instead of 7. Now that's no guarantee because Ouachita is going to be a 2-loss team, as is Missouri Western. So there's no guarantee that, and I don't know that the Western, that the numbers right. Yeah, they are right. Okay. So Ouachita could fall to 9-2. Missouri Western is 9-2. We know Ouachita's strength of schedule is going to be at 500. Missouri Westerns will be close.
Yep.
The regional numbers would be the same. And what we're looking at, though, is Missouri Western would have a 3-2 record against teams with a 500 record, and Ouachita would have a 2-2, and that could give Western the advantage they need to get to the 6th spot. Now, we don't know what's going to happen, but that's the best case best case scenario for Missouri Western. Did I leave anything out, John?
I think over the years, I would say, I know it's not mathematical, so we can't show it on the screen, but over the years, the committee has shown a preference, I think, to MIAA teams over GAC teams. I think that's been proven with last year Northwest making the field over Henderson State, who had, I think, the same record last year.
And
or
Truman
Harding.
State, too, the GLVC,
yes. They have certainly shown a preference over that with
right.
Truman last year.
Right. Well, I think you're right, because earlier in the year, Pitt State was ranked over Harding, and when they were both undefeated. So I think you're right. Please continue. Yeah.
So I think that makes it a pretty simple Ouachita loses, Western wins, Western's in type of scenario with that. And the other thing I would note too is with Indy possibly losing, I think we all expect Davenport to lose this week.
Yes.
Davenport would fall out of contention. So you could look at Indianapolis as basically being the 8 right now. And if they win, likely being the 8. So there's not a whole lot of because I just pulled up Southern Arkansas' schedule to see if there was a chance they could jump, since a 2-loss Mo West has jumped UND, could they if they win, but they have a 2-win team they're playing this week. So I don't think they will be jumping them.
In addition, John, if you look at that, their schedule is such that those 2 losses were against Ouachita and Harding, and they got their doors blown off. So
I'm not saying they deserve to by any means, but
I'm saying, but even though it's not part of the criteria, I guarantee that the committees see that and understand they're not competitive with playoff caliber teams.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's pretty simple, honestly, for Mo West. It's you need Ouachita to lose. UND obviously could. I just don't think they're going to, even though I know they had that win over Truman. Southwest did, but I think it's pretty simple. You can tune in while you're watching the Western game and listen to old Rex Nelson's call down there at Ouachita, and I would be following that game at the same time the Western game goes on, because I think that's the key. And if we look up farther in the bracket, the other 2 teams that are involved in this, Pitt and in Central Missouri, I think if they win, they are pretty well locked into their places as well. We were talking pre-show, those 2 losses or those not losses, those 2 games that don't count as D2 games for Ferris State. Well, I guess one just didn't happen, and then the other one would be the Montana loss that they had that doesn't count. I think those keep Ferris out of that and make Ferris a horrifying team if they are coming to either the Jungle or Warrensburg this week. They are the team I would say you do not want to see on your schedule. But I think that the rest is pretty well locked in. And Brandon, you know the numbers more than I do. Do you think Grand Valley and Harding is a debate this week, or do you think Harding, if they win, is pretty well locked into that top seed?
All right, I think There's a debate, but my gut says it's Harding, like a 75-25, 70-30 kind of thing. If you look at the numbers, Grand Valley's strength of schedule is a lot higher, but they they do have one fewer game. I wish that didn't count against them. I hope it doesn't, and I hope they're just looking at the losses and the strength of schedule, because quite frankly, the MIAA has been part of the reason why Grand Valley's had trouble scheduling games. So I would hope that, or not hope, because I really don't care who's one or two there, but I would think that Harding will keep the number one rating based simply on being undefeated, even though their strength of schedule is going to be 90 points lower, because Harding will finish at 500. Grand Valley's playing Davenport, and Davenport's an 8-1 team, so they're going to add that. It's going to be 585 or somewhere around there, and then they'll have another win against a regionally ranked team. So that one last category will still favor Harding at 2-0 versus 2-1, but the strength of schedule, Grand Valley will go to 4-1 with games against teams over 500. So they would have the same number of wins, but they would have a loss. And then the strength of schedule would be higher. So I think there's a discussion to be had, but my gut does tell me that it would be Harding.
And to clarify, especially for maybe some Missouri Western fans that haven't been through this process lately, the top 4 teams are seeded, and the number 1 team, will assume it's Harding, will get a bye. And those first round games would be hosted at Grand Valley, Pittsburgh, and Central Missouri. But then those next 3 teams that make the playoffs could play any of those teams. It is not a 7 has to play 2 scenario and things like that. There's a lot of things that go into that with money and mileage and hopefully avoiding some rematches, but that doesn't seem too likely.
Let me interject something, John.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, because there are lots of assumptions I make that people understand this whole process, and I don't even need to talk about that. That's a weakness of doing a national show than coming and doing something specific to a conference. The one thing I want to add, though, if Indianapolis does make it, like let's do a scenario in which Ouachita Baptist loses. Missouri Western is in the playoffs, so 3 MIAA teams are in there. But then Indianapolis knocks Ouachita out of the playoffs. An earned access team in the 7 has to go play the 2. So by rule, Indianapolis would have to go to Grand Valley. That would mean that only the 5-6 were essentially free agents that could be placed against any opponent. That is one thing to consider. And again, just being thorough with our description of the regional rankings and what's going on.
And look at it from an MIAA perspective, that would basically guarantee a rematch in the first round, because you take Grand Valley off the table, which I don't think they were sending them there anyway. I would like that to happen to avoid the rematch. But if that's the way it plays out, Missouri Western, I would guess Missouri Western would go to either Pittsburgh or Central Missouri. And I don't know how they would determine that. They would just go mileage or maybe send them to Warrensburg. I don't know that. But
well, the one final thought I'm going to have on this, and this is more of a national thing. There is also the opportunity or the potential that some teams will get moved out of our region and into another region, and there's a swap. It's going way too far into the weeds. But
I was going to say, I was scared to bring it up.
Yes, yeah, but there's a possibility that Augustana and or Mankato State, Minnesota State, could be like at Pitt State or at Central Missouri as well. So it depends on what happens, and it would be the result of a cost-saving measure by the NCAA, in which they could reduce the number of charter flights, which are around about $100,000 for each flight. So,
and if they flip out, that would mean somebody else would be leaving ours, and that could easily be Missouri Western in a scenario where they made it in, because they're kind of the easiest to flip with a and send to a Northern Sun or send out to Colorado.
Right.
Maybe.
Just never
But
know.
way
Ferris is
too
also
far in
an
the
outlier.
weeds.
Ferris is also an outlier that could go
Yes.
to Super Region 1, and that Super Region 1 would be the main predicator of this, because New Haven could get an earned access there. Anyway, that's way too far into the weeds. So what needs to happen again, to reiterate, Ouachita needs to lose, Western needs to win, and that would look pretty good for Missouri Western, just to keep it simple. So, all right. Hey, when we come back, we will take a look at this week's games. Just wanted to take this opportunity to thank those who have supported D2 football this year. D2 football is free, but it isn't cheap. Your support helps offset our expenses and allows us to expand our coverage. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us. Visit d2football.com/support. Or if you want to do it the old-fashioned way, click contact on the website to find our mailing address. But again, thank you for supporting D2 football. All right, let's go ahead and look at what we got going on this week in the MIAA. Central Missouri is at Lincoln. Emporia State is at Fort Hays. Northeastern State is at Washburn. Nebraska Kearney is at Northwest Missouri. Missouri Western plays at Missouri Southern, and Central Oklahoma plays at Pittsburgh State. At the start of the show, I said that I was not impressed with any of these games. I think I'm going to get a little pushback from John on that. Which game do you think is actually interesting this week, John?
There are two that are interesting to me. One is solely for the playoff implications. I think if you had to pick a game of the week this week, you pick Missouri Western, Missouri Southern, because that game matters. Missouri Western needs to win that game to have a chance. The game I'm most interested in, just a competitive standpoint, I think is Emporia State and Fort Hays State. It's been a really good bounce back year for Fort Hays. We'll get more into that later, but I just think that's a really interesting matchup, and I'm curious to see, because against the good teams, Emporia State's defense has fallen flat this year. I think that could be a nice way to end for Emporia State's defense if they can get a nice win against Hays. And Braden Gleason's going to put up his points. So for Hays, Jack Dawson kind of has to keep pace there. So I think that's the game of the week. I mostly agree with you. It's not a great slate.
Yeah, what would you pick for a score on that one then?
Now you put me on the spot.
Yes,
I have it in the paper somewhere. What my score will be in today's paper, but
okay.
Off the top of my head, I would go like 38-34. And I'd probably still pick Emporia, even though I picked Hays in the paper.
Okay.
But I think Emporia would win that game.
Fair enough. I'm predicting a Fort Hays 28-27 win. What was the other one you said? Missouri Western or Missouri Southern?
Yes. I think that's the interesting one there. And that's solely because of playoff and just what rides on that game. And I know our mutual friend Matt Daniel pick Southern in that. That might be a little bear cut colored glasses there, but
I see.
I would pick Mo West, but I think that's a competitive game. I would say like 35 to maybe 24 or something. It'd be competitive going down the stretch.
That's 35-24 is a good prediction. I'm going to go off, be out in left field though. I'm going to predict Missouri Western, motivated by the potential playoff berth, wins 42-24.
That's a solid.
Missouri Southern is coming off a game where they kind of got handled to them. So, what do you got? What do we want next? None of the rest are really, in my opinion, that interesting.
How many touchdowns Huh?
Would you say Central Pitt might be the next one if you were looking at it?
Yeah, I would probably. Well, in terms of just competitiveness and close game, I would say Northeastern State and Washburn.
Oh my God, that just means you're a masochist. All right, tell me about that game.
It's the two worst teams in the league right now. Yeah. Washburn has young guys; they have excuses for being down there. I think, I don't know. Is the question is Washburn just ready for their season to be over?
Mm-hmm.
I think for JJ Ecker and that bunch, he's a guy that's got a lot of respect around the league, despite Northeastern State perennially being where Northeastern State is. I think they will be motivated to try to get an MIAA win. So I think that game might be a little tighter. I would still pick Washburn by maybe 10 points or so. I don't think it's a blowout though.
I was going to predict a blowout, 38-10 in favor
it
of
could go
Washburn.
that way. It certainly could.
Yep. All right. Which one do you want to go to next? Doesn't matter to me. We got
how many touchdowns do you think Zach Zabrowski's throwing for this week?
See,
he padded that Harlan Hill candidacy.
All right. Here's what I have. The score I'm going to predict is 52-7, but I think it could have been 77-7. But I think they're going to get the guys out. I think that's what a smart coach would do, and I think Josh Lamberson's a smart coach.
I think Lambeau's probably smart. I think Cedric Case might throw for about 4 or 5 more touchdowns.
There you go. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking more like 4 and 3. You know,
they might have one of the best backup quarterbacks in the country. So he's
the guy who was the starter at the beginning of the year. So.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have a prediction on that score for that one?
I think I put in the paper that it would be, 72-10. So,
okay, fair enough.
It's up there.
Okay, let's look at Nebraska Kearney at Northwest Missouri then. This doesn't have the same amount of fun that the last few years have had.
Yeah.
I predict Northwest win 35-10.
Yeah, this game is interesting. I don't think Kearney can win this game. But, Rich Wright the last few years has shut down that TJ Davis option game. So maybe, even though it doesn't work as well against the rest of the league, what they're doing, it might work a little better against Northwest because it's more passing oriented. I would tend to agree 35-10, somewhere in there, maybe a few less points. I think Hohensy's playing as healthy as he has since that injury. So I think they'll put up points, and I don't know if Nebraska Kearney wants to tackle Jay Harris for 4 quarters. So I think you're probably pretty accurate with that one. I tend to agree.
All right, and then finally, Central Oklahoma is at Pitt State. I think it's time for Pitt State to get serious about playing 4 quarters of football this year. If they're going to do it, they're going to start this week. I have them winning 35-17.
Yeah, I think they're angry this week. I think that could be even more. I think I had 42-10 or something in the paper this week. I just think they'll be mad this week. It'll depend a little bit on Chad Dotson's health, and we talked about that earlier. If he's playing, I think they can really, really make this a blowout. Ty Pennington's played well, except for last week this year. So I think they're okay if they have to go to the backup, but last week he really struggled. So we'll see. Maybe it'll be good for him to get some confidence before the playoffs.
They have a good defense, and Central Oklahoma's not really moving the ball and scoring that well this year, so that's probably an advantage for Pitt State. All right, well, that's a look at what I think is a kind of a lackluster week in the MIAA. I don't have it in me to lie and say that something's good when it's not. So I'm like not your best promoter, because I'm just like, no, this kind of stinks. But
you don't want to do 30 minutes with me on Northeastern State and Washburn?
Exactly. I just don't have it in me. I said at the beginning of the show that next week we'll have a Super Region 3 show to go along with the show for every other region to preview the playoffs, rather than have a column or a podcast for the individual conference. Because of that, we won't have a chance, an opportunity to really dive into the MIAA all-conference team or react to what the coaches picked. So we're instead, I threw this last minute at John, but I had already made a lot of guesses, and I said, John, take a look at this and help me out where there are holes. And this is kind of what we came up with in terms of what we think might be the first team, all MIAA team. Let's start with quarterback. And in your mind, is there any doubt who it is?
No, there's not. And we said earlier, Brandon Gleason, like those numbers are insane. They should both be nominated for the Harlan Hill, probably. I don't know if they'll both be finalists. Zabrowski definitely will be. But Zach Zabrowski is, for my money, the best quarterback in the nation this year. I know there's a fella out at Colorado School of Mines that is a pretty dang good quarterback himself, but for my money, Zach Zabrowski is the best there is, and those numbers are ridiculous. And with what he's done with that team and elevating them, I just don't think you can argue quarterback this year.
I agree. I mean, Gleason obviously considered, but
Yeah,
you've got to land on Zabrowski. Looking at running back, we picked two. What are your thoughts, and who should the two running backs be, John?
I mean, for me, and I think we agree on this, Jay Harris for Northwest and Marcellus Hawkins for UCM. Offensively, you're going to notice a lot of UCM guys on this list, and that's because their offense has been doing what it's been doing this year. But Jay Harris has had 100 yards in all 10 games this year. He is almost 400 yards ahead of Hawkins as the league's leading rusher, 1,300 yards this year, 12 touchdowns. He's been great all year for them, and I don't think there's much doubt that he deserves to be in that spot. And Hawkins has really come on as the year's gone. He early in the season, I don't think we'd be saying he had that second spot locked up, but I think he does at this point. 946 yards, 15 touchdowns, leads the league in touchdowns. He's also a threat for Zabrowski in the passing game. I think it's kind of an open and shut case with running back.
I agree. Let's move on to wide receiver. When I started working on the wide receiver, Arkell Smith was initially on the team. Like, there was just no doubt he was going to be part of it. The second receiver required a little deeper dive, and I landed on Tyler Common. Is that where you would have landed? And if not, who would you have gone with?
It's that second spot is tough. Arkell, we both agree, lock. You can't argue it. When you initially brought this up, my first thought was Arkell Smith, Jalen Varner. Right. Because when I think of Emporia, he's the first one I think leads a lot of game plans because he's so explosive on the outside. But look at the stats. Tyler Commons actually had more yards per catch, and he's edging him out in all the receiving categories. He leads the conference in receiving touchdowns. I think it's got to be Tyler Common. I agree. Jalen Varner is a very strong third receiver. If we were running these teams like the way real offenses are run, all three of those guys would be on there. And maybe Jonas Bennett from Missouri Western or Kashawn Griffin. I would probably lead Bennett for that if we were naming a fourth person. But no, there's a lot of good receivers, and a lot of those good receivers come from UCM and Emporia State. And I think it's only right that the two first teamers would be a Mule and a Hornet.
That's true too. Yeah. Tight end. I don't think there's any doubt.
Devin Garrison. Let's move on.
Yeah,
it's obvious.
Yeah, obviously, that's no disrespect, but he's obviously the top tight end in the league, and he's up high in receiving statistics, which is insane for tight ends. So, the offensive line is always tough. Even when I help pick an Elite 100 team, it's a little easier than actually doing the all-conference line for any conference, because there are a number of factors. When you look at the line, do you know what their assignment is on the play? Do you know if they executed it with the technique that the coaching staff wanted them to? Who is the hardest to for defensive linemen to face. So when I did this, what I simply started doing was reaching out to people that I know in the league, which is quite a few after 25 years, and started talking about who they thought the best offensive linemen were. So I'm pretty sure, but not as confident about this as I would be, honestly, about my Elite 100 offensive line first team. So, but nonetheless, Trace Jeffries from Pitt State, Hunter Hayes from Nebraska Kearney, Gabe Clark from UCM, Evan Clark from Missouri Western, and Keith Russell also from Missouri Western. And those were the 5 guys that I landed on. John, I kind of believe that you agree with me that this is a hard position to select.
Yeah. Whenever I'm talking to offensive linemen, I always try to talk to the coaches because they're the ones that are going to pour over the tape and know a guy they can take advantage of or a guy they just better go the other way against. But I think it's interesting to look at the rushing statistics. Missouri Western leads the league in rush yards per game at just over 194. Then Northwest Missouri, we talked about Jay Harris, 192 yards a game. And then it's about 20-yard gap down to Pittsburgh State. So I think it's fitting that Missouri Western, they do it running back by committee, and whoever is in there is productive. So I think it's very fitting that we have 2 guys from Missouri Western on this line. And Trace Jeffries, Hunter Hayes, those guys have been doing it for several years in the league, and they're first team guys from last year. So I think you have a good list, even if it's a hard list to come up with.
It is. All right. Defensive line. What were your thoughts on the defensive linemen that we have?
I think we'll start off with the top. Dakari Streeter, he's been a force for Mo West all year. I think they have been very good at sacking quarterback, and he is a guy that has been near the top. And I think that's a really good place to start. I think we both started our list with him. Jake Fisher is another guy. Northwest Missouri State is always going to have a defensive lineman on this list, and Jake Fisher's earned his spot. He's kind of followed up in that Elijah Green, Zach Howard, Sam Roberts. We could go back a million guys. He's the leader of that group, and I think he deserves to be on there too. The last 2 spots, there were a lot of names to consider, and I'll let you go first and say who you kind of landed on with those guys.
Well, I want to start. I have Tell Spies in there. For sure, because I wanted to make sure we had like a real interior guy on the line, and he's doing a heck of a job to make plays in the backfield like he is in the interior. It's usually your tackles for loss, your sacks are done by defensive ends unless you're at Northwest Missouri State, and Tell's doing a good job there. So I really wanted to I didn't want to have a defensive line with all DNs, which can happen sometimes, and I fight against even in our Elite 100 teams. And then Miles Minges from Fort Hays is widely regarded around the league as a great defensive lineman, even though Fort Hays has another player that is being compared, and some even think might even be better than Miles, and that's Parrish Terry. Now, he's not on the first team, but you might hear his name a little later. Let's go ahead and move on to linebackers. We have Colton Winder, Jack Barkley, and John Johnson from Southern, Pitt, and Fort Hays. Linebacker is always a tough position to me too. Like, I always feel much better about my D-line selections, the linebacker, because linebackers have to do so much. So how do you know that you got a versatile linebacker? Is a guy who can, sure, you might have a lot of tackles. Does that mean his defense doesn't get off the field? Does he have any ability to play in coverage, or is he truly a downhill guy? But that's probably accurate. The list is probably where we think it'll wind up. Any objections on that one? to that list?
No. Another thing I'd mention with the linebackers is, I mean, they're obviously most of the time the quarterbacks of the defense, and it's hard to tell if a guy is beyond his value because he's getting a team into the right spots with those top defenses in the league, or so it's just hard. It's hard to look just based on tackle numbers.
Right.
But that is kind of what we're given, not seeing these guys week to week. So I think that's a good list, and those guys all play for good defenses too, which helps me feel better about this list.
Exactly. All right, and I will finish out the secondary. Warrior Noel from Central Missouri, Khalil Smith from Northwest, Michael Lacey from Pitt, and Jordan Rogers from Pitt. So 2 Pitt State guys there. They've kind of been air traffic control or whatever all year long at Pitt.
Yeah, that safety duo with Michael Lacey and Jordan Rogers has been great all year. Throwing a guy like Rico Payton at corner, and there's a reason it's hard to score points on Pittsburgh State. They've got a good defense there, and when you throw in Khalil Smith and Warrior Noel, that's a good group. It was a good year for DBs, I think, in the MIAA. So it's kind of hard parsing out these, but yeah, those Pitt State guys to me kind of highlight that list with what they've been able to accomplish.
Right. Moving on to special teams, Austin Schmidt at Pitt State is the kicker. Russ Brungart at Emporia is the punter. And I picked one returner, even though he could have picked a kicker and a punt returner. But wound up with Colby Katzis at Pitt State. And I think you were a fan of that pick.
Yeah, Katniss is he's been a really good player ever since he was the freshman of the year in the league last year. Stepped into a bigger role with them graduating receivers, and he's just a weapon. He's a nice complement to Devin Garrison there for their passing game, and teams don't like to kick to him, that's for sure either. So I think that's a good pick.
Okay. Every year the league picks offensive, defensive, freshman of the year, and coach of the year. I don't think the offense is any surprise. It's Dabrowski, right? I mean, as much as we've talked about him, it has to be him. Certainly you could have thought of Gleason and could have thought of Harris, but it's a passing era of football, and Dabrowski's doing it better than anybody who's ever done it in terms of numbers in the league. So
no argument from me. I think he's the best player in the nation, so clearly that makes him the best player in the MIAA.
Okay, when started to put this together. And I'm not a stats guy. Former coach at Missouri Western, Jerry Partridge, said one time, stats are for losers. And I fell in love with that because stats are usually used by the losers to try to justify or try to explain why they should have won. And I've loved that ever since I heard that. So when I was talking to Matt Witwicky about this, he said, well, who would be your defensive player of the year? And without even looking at stats or anything, I picked Dakari Streeter. Having said that, once I dove into the stats, I think the answer is correct, that it's him.
Yeah.
You disagree?
I do not disagree. Look at the stats. It's nice when the stats back up what the tape said.
Right. Exactly.
And look at sacks in the league, 12.5 for Dakari. Second is Miles out at Fort Hays with 6.5. So he's almost got double what the next guy's got. He leads in tackles for losses. He is the leader of that. Mo West has had a good defensive line in the last few years, but it has ticked up a notch, and it's because he has brought it there. Him and CJ Ravenel and some of those guys are really good players on the front. And if they make the playoffs, that's going to be a big reason why, is how their front has done. So I could not agree more with that pick.
All right. Freshman of the year is a little harder. I mean, because there were a couple of different ways to go. Washburn has Sam Van Dyne playing quarterback. He's had good and bad, but he's a true freshman on a bad team. Who was another guy that you thought maybe would be a candidate before we announced who we selected for freshman?
Yeah. There's a couple ways to go. It's hard to predict because so many of these are stat based, like you said before. My my leading candidate and who I'm leaning towards, I know you have another name, is DJ Bell from Washburn. True freshman too, not even a redshirt freshman coming in. They've been ravished by injuries, as anybody who's followed Washburn all knows. And he's stepped in to be their go-to receiver, over 500 yards this year. Nobody wants to kick to him. He could have been a option in that kick returner spot too, because he's a really good player. So I like DJ Bell, but I also like your selection.
Yes, and I went with Parrish Terry, who's a defensive lineman at Fort Hays, putting up good numbers and getting lots of high marks from coaches around the league about his ability. So I was a D-line guy myself, so I kind of maybe favor that position. So that's why I went with Parrish Terry. I do know, and this will be the last thing that we discussed tonight, Coach of the Year. We went in two different directions. I went with Tyler Fenwick. I thought about some others, and including if there was a comeback Coach of the Year, it would have been Chris Brown, because Fort Hays hasn't been that good the last 2 years after being really good for a while and then having another good season this year. But you landed on a completely different coach.
Yeah, I think this one kind of comes down to what team were you most surprised by how well they did this year? And that's, for me, that's UCM, and their coach is Josh Lamberson. The job he's done with that offense, he's an offensive guy, and he's ran that offense to where it's the best in the country right now. I had them, I think, 8th in my preseason poll, which I was lower on them than most. And boy, that doesn't look smart right now. Because I just didn't know what was different from last year. And I don't know if anything is. I mean, Zach Zabrowski is different. That's one thing. But they came in, and that offense has just taken off. So I just think Josh Lamberson's job with that group has been really impressive. And not that Tyler Fenwick's hasn't been, but if I could do co-coaches, I would probably name them co-coaches, but that's a wimp's way out of this. So if we're picking somebody, I'm going to name Josh Lamberson.
Very good, John. Well, that will do it for our show for today. I want to thank Central Missouri Athletics as well as KNPG. MIAA Weekly is a production of D2Football.com. We want to invite you to join us every Sunday night at 7 Central for an inside look at Division II football on our show called Inside D2 Football. You can visit the homepage of D2Football.com every Sunday for the link. So, John, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And for Jon Dykstra, I'm Brandon Misener. Thank you for watching.